The Head was a show that I had never even heard about up until recently when it was recommended to me by channel editor Uno Afex. It began its run in late 1994 when I was only a couple of months old, so it's fair to say it was a little bit before my time. Fun fact, I was born on the same day as the O.J. Simpson car chase. Bet my mom had a good time watching that while she was in labor. Anyway, upon learning about the Head's existence, I searched it up and honestly, it didn't impress me that much from a passing glance. The title sounded very generic, and that, along with the crude character designs, made me think this was some kind of wannabe Beavis and Butthead knockoff. So, despite the suggestion, I never paid much attention. That was until we ended up putting the series on one day at Uno's place, and this was not what I expected, even remotely. I was shocked, not only because I ended up liking the show quite a bit, but also because its structure, tone, and overall development was much different than what I anticipated. Even though it had a brief run, I'm really surprised that more people don't talk about The Head, as I genuinely believe that this was one of the most groundbreaking cartoons of the mid-90s, and that's saying something. In order to explain why that is, I think it's important to set the stage by talking about what led to The Head's creation. You see, years before we'd see the likes of Adult Swim dominating the market, the primary channel to watch crude drawings say bad words was MTV. In case you were born after the year 2000, MTV was, and technically still is, a channel that rose to prominence back in the 80s and 90s. This is where people would go to watch music videos before the internet made that much easier and more convenient. While this was their claim to fame, the network eventually decided to branch off from their music video roots in order to produce a wide variety of content to draw in more viewers throughout the years. This included, but was not limited to, reality programs, documentary series, stunt and prank shows, and of course, animated series aimed at adults. The first cartoon that MTV ever produced was Liquid Television, which launched in 1991. Essentially, Liquid Television was an anthology show consisting of unrelated segments from different artists, somewhat similar to Nickelodeon's Oh Yeah Cartoons or Cartoon Network's What a Cartoon Show, except years earlier. Much like those two programs, Liquid Television segments sometimes became the launching pad for a few of the shows that would later be found on the network. The most notable example of this was a little show you may have heard of called Beavis and Butthead, which quickly became the most popular and recognizable segment on Liquid Television. While MTV outsourced their animation to different studios for Liquid Television's production, they aspired to create their own in-house animation studio for future projects. Thus, MTV Animation was formed in 1993, and with it came the huge success that was Beavis and Butthead's standalone show. Having struck gold right out of the gate, MTV Animation started getting more shows greenlit left and right in order to hopefully recapture some of the same success they found with Mike Judge's creation. As a result, the studio's second project came to reality in 1994 when they aired the first episode of The Head. I'm not exactly sure what date it premiered. Some sites say August, some say September, and others say December, so if you can find an official, reliable source, leave it in the comments, because I couldn't. It was featured on a planned lineup called MTV Oddities, which was marketed as a new format for the network. Rather than being your typical episodic cartoon format, shows under this label would follow a continuous story arc that would be built upon in subsequent episodes. While MTV continued producing many animated shows after this, only two were made under the official MTV Oddities label. The other show was The Max, created off the comic book series of the same name, but that's a different story for a different day. Probably. The Head was the first MTV show created by Eric Fogle, who later went on to create series such as Surveillance, Glenn Martin DDS, and by far his biggest hit, Celebrity Deathmatch. While Fogel would eventually go on to find great success on the network, The Head only ended up being 2 seasons long with a total of 14 episodes. That might sound like a brief run, but it won't come as a surprise to those familiar with MTV Animation's history. Sure, the network greenlit a lot of animated series throughout the years, but almost all of their projects were subsequently cancelled pretty quickly. The only animated shows I'd describe as having relatively decent runs on the network were Beavis and Butthead, Daria, and Celebrity Deathmatch, with every other project getting 3 seasons at most, and usually less than that. While certain series such as Aeon Flux, Clone High, and Undergrads have gone on to have strong cult followings, The Head remains more or less forgotten and overlooked by wider audiences. I couldn't find a single YouTube video talking about the show for more than 90 seconds, and when I looked, all I found were reviews of the 2020 series also called The Head. God damn it, first reboot and now The Head. Here's some advice. If you're going to make a new show, why don't you do a quick internet search and find out if there's a show already out there with that exact same title? That's only going to make this already obscure and underrated series that much harder to find. Regardless, now that I've explained the circumstances around the show's existence, let's get into the show itself. The head stars an ordinary man named Jim, who wakes up one morning to find out that his head has grown to epic proportions. It turns out that a purple alien nicknamed Roy has inhabited Jim's cranium in order to hide from humans and become accustomed to Earth's atmosphere. Roy claims that he has come to Earth on a mission to save it from parasitic aliens that destroyed his home planet. He also resolves to help Jim out with his personal issues by making him into a more confident person, as well as giving him some cool new powers in order to fight evil. Watching the first episode, I thought I understood well enough where the series was going. I figured that this was going to be an episodic story where Jim and Roy find themselves in a new situation each week, and hijinks ensue. The second episode made it clear that this wasn't the case, as it picked up immediately where the first episode ended. That really surprised me. Sure, serialized animated series are quite commonplace nowadays, but The Head was released in 1994. Serialization in general was becoming more popular on television around this time with the release of Twin Peaks in 1990, but keep in mind, popularity surrounding adult animation on television was also in its infancy around this time. The Simpsons had only been on the air for about 5 years, and other popular series like Beavis and Butthead, Space Ghost Coast to Coast, and Duckman were just starting out. The Head is the first show to really combine these two formats as far as I can tell, making it the very first heavily serialized animated series produced in America. Another thing that really surprised me about The Head is that it's not a comedy, at least, not strictly. Don't get me wrong, there are still a lot of funny moments and the jokes and humor really add to the experience as a whole. However, I wouldn't really say that that's the focus of the series. I'd describe The Head as a science fiction action adventure with elements of comedy present throughout. So, not only was this show ahead of its time in terms of the serialized approach, but it was also kind of the first animated series from North America to not really be a comedy. Now, before anyone starts preemptively typing in the comments, yes, I am aware that Aeon Flux started producing episodes back in 1991, and yes, that was a serialized non-comedic cartoon that was aimed at adults. That is true, but you have to remember that Aeon Flux was still a part of Liquid Television at that point. It didn't become its own independent show until its third season, which aired in 1995. Thus, The Head via MTV Oddities was the first time we ever got a standalone serialized animated series that wasn't exactly a comedy by nature. That's only scratching the surface of how this show broke new ground, but more on that later. The second episode follows Jim having a date with Madeline, a girl from his arc welding class, while Roy gives him advice from within his head. Initially, it seems like Roy may be a villain who's manipulating Jim. This isn't helped by the fact that Roy has a strange sense of humor and insists that Jim ignore each and every one of his physician's phone calls who is trying to cure him. Regardless, he seems to be keeping up his end of the bargain. The evil alien Gork then shows up to wreak havoc, making it quickly apparent that Roy was indeed telling the truth and his intentions were pure. Upon seeing his enormous head, Madeline suggests that Jim join a support group for people with human anomalies. I figured that these were going to be one-off characters who we'd meet and then move on from after the episode was over, and once again, The Head proved me wrong. Not only are the support group members recurring characters who make up most of the show's supporting cast, but they absolutely become integral to the plot, teaming up with Jim and Roy to help save the world. The group includes Ivan, a man with a mouth in his chest, Chin, a Chinese immigrant who has long leg syndrome, Earl, a person with a fishbowl lodged in his mouth, Ray, a man with a lawn blower blade stuck in his skull, Mona, a beautiful woman who refuses to open up about her abnormality, and Raquel, a woman who
I look like a rat.
In addition to thinking they wouldn't be that important, I also figured that these were going to be pretty shallow characters whose deficiencies would more or less be their defining traits. I will say that while the show obviously isn't above using the characters' issues for the sake of comedy sometimes, I was surprised at how layered and endearing they ended up being. There's even a really sweet arc I won't spoil where Roy helps one of the support group members become more accepting of their abnormality in a way that also ties into the main plot. Eric Fogle clearly had a lot of sympathy for the characters he wrote here, and he wanted to make sure they all had distinct personalities and weren't portrayed as freaks who were the sum of their issues. That is with the exception of Earl, who pretty much is just a dude with a fishbowl in his head. Kinda forgot he even existed until I watched through some episodes a second time. Still, The other members of the support group make for some of my favorite characters, especially Ray, who is really funny and sympathetic. Although, I do want to say, if you have a show where one of your main characters is named Roy, try to think of a different name than Ray. That gets confusing. I also really love the group leader, Shane Blackman. You can tell that he means well, but he ends up talking to the group in a patronizing way that makes it come across like he's talking to children. He kind of reminds me of Mr. Van Driesen from Beavis and Butthead in his demeanor and misguided attempts to connect with those around him.
Would anyone like to suggest a name for Ray's blade? I'll start. How about Shelley?
Speaking of Beavis and Butthead, let's get into some of the visual comparisons. When Uno Aphex initially recommended this show to me, he thought the show was a creation of Mike Judge since the animation looked so similar. I can't say that I blame him. Given that The Head was the second show helmed by MTV Animation, you can definitely tell that a lot of the character designs and art style are very reminiscent of, well, the only show they produced prior to this one. Now, I love Beavis and Butthead as much as the next guy, but the show wasn't exactly known for its visual flair. The series didn't even have a proper art director until the production of Beavis and Butthead Do America, so according to Mike Judge, simple things like consistent color palettes were never even considered in early seasons of the show. With that in mind, yeah, it doesn't surprise me one bit that MTV Animation's second project also came out with pretty crude visuals that resembled the only thing they had made prior to that. However, The Head doesn't try to hide this one bit, and even makes meta references to how it looks so similar to Beavis and Butthead. The character Dr. Axel's hair and head are clearly reminiscent of Beavis, and I don't think that was a coincidence. And hey, if you're still not convinced, the first episode makes an even more direct reference when Butthead himself makes an appearance. No, I'm not joking. Out of nowhere, about 5 minutes into the episode, Butthead shows up to give a news tape to 2 government agents. After this, he literally gets his ass kicked and is never seen again in any capacity. Considering Mike Judge offered to lend his voice here, you can definitely tell that this is all in good fun. Although I guess that means that The Head and Beavis and Butthead take place in the same universe, which I'm cool with.
Here. What you got there, dork? I'll take that.
That sucked.
While The Head is crudely animated, it does clearly do the best it can with its limited resources. I'm willing to bet that, unlike Beavis and Butthead, this series did have an art director, as there are a lot more shots that are dynamic and have lots of visual emphasis. The first couple minutes of the pilot do look very rough, likely from the show not having a whole lot of funding at this point. The visuals do improve later in the episode and keep improving throughout the rest of the season and into the second season. You can clearly see that Eric Fogle and his artists had a distinct style that they wanted to get across, and it works despite constraints and obvious visual comparisons. Beyond his hairdo resembling Beavis, Dr. Axel, Jim's hyperactive physician, is easily one of my favorite characters as he gets a lot of really funny moments. On the villain side of things, we have Gork, who, like I said, is the parasitic alien looking to feed off of humans. He isn't our hero's only adversary though, as they're also being chased by Dr. Lucas Elliott, a crazy member of an unspecified government agency who is looking to track down and capture Roy. Dr. Elliott can sort of be considered the secondary antagonist of the series after Gork, but he is not working alone. Under Elliott are 2 federal agents named Smithy and Marshall. Now, I have a lot to say about these 2 characters, but in order to do that, I do have to get into some spoiler territory. Since I'm willing to bet a lot of people haven't seen The Head, here's a timestamp for later in the video that you can skip to in case you don't want to be spoiled. Okay, 3, 2, 1, let's go. I kind of figured that Smithy and Marshall would be stoic, no-nonsense agents without much character or personality. That is somewhat true at first, but as Season 1 progresses, it turns out to be a total deconstruction of that trope. They reveal that under their stoic exteriors, they are actually both very sensitive men who are starved for emotional support after years of being berated by Dr. Elliott. A lot of the time in the latter half of the season is heavily implying that these 2 agents are gay and developing feelings for each other. They don't outright say it though. This was the 90s after all, where homosexuality was a much tabooer subject, and a lot of shows with gay characters tended to take the approach of making them implied, but not definitively homosexual. I figured that The Head was taking the same approach, but, for the 4th time, the show really surprised me in a big way. All the tension and build-up eventually leads to these 2 agents kissing each other at the end of the first season. Again, this was 1995, you didn't see this a whole lot on television. It got me wondering if this could possibly be the very first homosexual kiss in adult animated television history. After looking into it, my answer to that would be no and yes. Let me explain. The first animated series to feature a man kissing another man was the Simpsons episode Simpson and Delilah, which aired in 1990. That episode featured a character named Carl. No, not Carl with a C, Carl with a K. Right. Carl with a K was a character who worked as Homer's assistant in that episode, and while his sexuality was never outright stated, he is heavily implied to be gay. He was played by actor and gay civil rights spokesperson Harvey Fierstein, which further illustrates this point. During the episode, Carl kisses Homer on the mouth, which most people cite as the first male-to-male kiss on network television, period, let alone an animated series. While that is true as far as I know, is it technically the first gay kiss? Carl's sexuality is never outright stated, and we know for a fact that Homer isn't gay, even if he does like his beer cold, his TV loud, and his homosexuals flaming. My point is, while it may not have been technically the first male-to-male kiss, the head is the first kiss shared between two openly homosexual men as far as adult animated series are concerned. I'd consider this to be quite the risky move in the 90s, especially amongst viewers who were looking to watch edgy cartoons on a channel that was targeting teen to early adult demographics. Just another example of the head being, pardon the pun, ahead of its time. These two agents are easily among my favorite characters in the show, and I was really disappointed they didn't make any appearances after Season 1. I would really have loved a Season 2 episode that focused entirely on their relationship after the events of the first season. Maybe there was an episode planned and scrapped, but either way, they still make an impact from their inclusion in the first season. The first season of The Head ended its run in 1995 and consisted of 7 episodes. I think? Maybe 13 depending on how you want to look at it? For those of you who are unaware of how MTV liked to release their programming around this time, episodes of animated series were typically shorter than the 11-minute runtime that most people are used to. This is because, in addition to commercial breaks, MTV would often take time in the middle of episodes to feature popular music videos. Beavis and Butthead took the approach of satirizing this by having the duo comment over the videos themselves, but other shows did not have that format in mind. Now, The Head did have a half-hour time slot instead of a 15-minute one, with the episodes being split up into 2 different segments within that half hour. What's confusing though is that each segment of The Head has a different title, regardless of them airing in the same time slot with a break. That is with the exception of the season finale, which aired as a single episode on its own. Thus, some sources claim that The Head has 14 episodes, and some sources claim that it has 20. I also think that you could watch Season 1 all at once since it has a continuing story, and altogether is about the length of a movie, so that's an option too. So, the first season of The Head was a little hard to define in terms of its episode number, but the second season is much more cut and dry. Premiering in 1996, The Head's second season consisted of 7 episodes, each of which is 22 minutes long, and has one definitive title. I think MTV kinda realized the idea of playing music videos between clips wasn't working so well, so they stopped doing it pretty early on. Aside from Beavis and Butthead, of course, where they were part of that show's comedy. The Head Season 2 is a departure from Season 1 beyond the episode length, though. Instead of following one continuous story, each episode is a new situation following a different character, usually a different member of the support group. Rather than being the main focus of this season, Jim and Roy are usually found getting themselves involved in their friends' issues. The episodes also no longer have any continuity with each other, aside from them all taking place after the first season. They could really be watched in any order. We're also greeted with a brand new opening monologue that explains the events of the first season before jumping into an episode. I've talked a lot about shows on this channel like Moral Oral, Reboot, or The Venture Bros, which all started off with episodic formats before eventually making the slow turn into serialization. The Head, I'm pretty sure, is the first series we've covered that does the opposite, which is quite different from what I'm used to. I was intrigued to see how that would work. In those 3 aforementioned cases where the shows go from episodic to serialized, it was always to raise the stakes by making the events within the show have more meaning and substance. I was kind of worried that The Head would potentially drop the ball by doing the opposite and make the episodes feel less consequential or important. On the other hand, I did like the idea of delving into what Roy and Jim would be doing when they're not tasked with the duty of saving the entire planet. I also really like the concept of delving into the backstories of the other characters more thoroughly to give their stories and situations much more time to breathe and be fully realized. With a lot of curiosity, I checked out the second season, and yeah, it more or less met my expectations in both ways. It's really cool and interesting learning more about the secondary characters, and Jim and Roy's relationship is still very strong throughout. The show does kind of make them supporting characters in their story, but not in a bad way. They're simply passing the torch of primary development to those who were supporting characters from the first season. I think that's really clever, and it works out since all the cast members are very likable in their own way. We don't really see Jim and Roy have as many huge character-defining moments, but they don't really need to, since their arcs were fully fleshed out in the first season. They're also not totally absolved from development either, as we do learn more about them, specifically regarding Roy's family. At the same time, the second season does feel much less consequential than the first season due to how the new format of the series works. There's less build-up, and as a result, I did start to feel less excitement to check out every next episode right after the one I just watched. Let me make it clear, I do not think that The Head becomes a bad show in the second season. Far from it. There's still a lot of great stuff here, and I recommend anyone who liked the first season to check it out. For me personally though, I do prefer the first season overall due to the way it handled its story and gave it importance. I also admit that I might have been personally disappointed because the first season of The Head surprised me so much with its serialized structure. The second season was much more akin to what I was expecting from the show in the first place, so maybe my personal expectations played into my feelings a little bit. After season 2 of The Head aired, the show and MTV Oddities as a whole was discontinued by the network. Kind of a shame considering the first season and second season to an extent did have a lot of plot points that were never fully followed up on or addressed. Eric Fogle thought so too, and as a result, he started looking for another method in which he could conclude The Head's story. It didn't take him long either, as in 1996, later the same year that season 2 concluded, a comic follow-up to the series was released by MTV Books. Yeah, apparently that's a thing. Since The Head, A Legend is Born was co-written by the same creator of the show, I'm going to assume that the story here is canon with the series. The comic itself is based off of an unproduced episode which I assume was supposed to act as the second season's finale, if not a third season. It takes place after the events of season 2, and follows up on a lot of the hanging plot threads that were never concluded in the series, such as the fates of certain characters, as well as the development of some interpersonal relationships. It manages to retain the look and feel of the series quite well, and for me, it didn't feel like a downgrade taking the story into comic book form. If anything, it manages to feel a lot more dynamic in a lot of ways. The drawings often are much more detailed than the ones on the show, and you can feel the action during the fight sequences. Since they aren't restricted by animation costs, you can tell that they used this to accomplish certain things on a bigger scope than before in terms of the story, visuals, and action. It's a lot of fun and proves that Fogel knew how to transition his vision effectively onto the page. The book also has pop-up pages when you open it, such as a page that shows what's inside Roy's bag, or a map of the cosmos. I wouldn't know how well the pop-up itself works because I wasn't about to pay $200 on Amazon to get this, but based on what I saw, it was probably pretty cool. I don't want to get into specifics too much, as I'm sure many of my viewers haven't read an obscure comic based off of an obscure television show, and I don't want to ruin it for you. I will give my overall thoughts on it though, and say that The Head, A Legend is Born, was a great way to conclude the story. I'm not sure if the unproduced episode was originally conceived as the finale, or it ended up being reworked into one, but either way, what we got here really works. If you watched the first 2 seasons of The Head and really enjoyed them, I would actually call this comic mandatory to check out. Personally, I liked it more than season 2, but at the same time, it also made me grow a greater appreciation for the second season. While I didn't necessarily dislike the episodic format of that season, I did think it was an unfitting conclusion to the series that left way too much up in the air. This comic rectifies that, thus making season 2 of The Head the perfect middle point between the bigger stories of season 1 and A Legend is Born. That about does it for The Head. The only other thing that might be worth noting is that there were plans to make a video game based off the series for the Sega Genesis and Super Nintendo. The source code for the Genesis version has been released by Eric K. Stratton, one of the Head, don't pardon that pun, programmers on the project. He also worked on games such as Sonic Spinball and the Sega versions of Demolition Man and Frankenstein Through the Eyes of the Monster. He said that the Head game would have been built on the same engine he used for Demolition Man. Development didn't get very far before being cancelled, never even making it to beta on the Genesis version, and having absolutely no work done on the SNES version. Based on what Stratton recalled, the game was going to follow the events of the first season quite closely, with each of the 7 levels being based on different areas seen in the show. The titles for those episodes are Neighborhood, Museum, Liberty, Hillbilly, Headhunter, Government, and Invasion. I'll leave a link in the description for an interview with Stratton if you want to learn more information. If you're in the same boat as me and never even heard about this show up until now, I definitely recommend this underrated gem. Do I understand why the head has been forgotten about over the years? Kind of. It definitely would have been a change of pace for its time, and from the outside looking in, the show's crude animation and title does make it look like a wannabe Beavis and Butthead clone. I'm also not sure if the MTV audience, whose attention spans generally lasted the length of a 3 to 4 minute music video, were ready for a serialized story which they had to follow and remember week after week. That might have been part of the reason it was cancelled prematurely and switched to an episodic format for its second season. That being said, I am kind of surprised the show hasn't developed a stronger cult following over the years, like a lot of other shortly lived MTV programs. It clearly was doing a lot of things that were not the norm for animated series around this time, and taking risks with the format that, in my opinion, really paid off. It has endearing characters, solid humor, unexpected twists, and a good mix of different tones. The voice acting is also really good, especially from Jim and Madeline, who have hilariously deadpan voices that contrast the zaniness around them. I also love Roy's voice, which sounds menacing when you first hear it, which makes you think he might be the villain. When he proves himself to be a hero, it makes for a great contrast. I wish I could tell you more details on who voiced who, but due to the obscure nature of the show, it's really hard to find specific information about it. Looking at the IMDb page, there is a cast list available, but most of the credits do not say which character each cast member played, and many of them are listed as playing Self, which doesn't make sense in any universe. The Wikipedia page also states that the show is notable for featuring the very first performance by John DiMaggio, who is probably best known for playing Bender on Futurama and Jake on Adventure Time. Okay, that's cool, but I searched high and low and I couldn't find out who he played on the head, or even an IMDb credit for it. For the record, John DiMaggio is listed in the credits for the Season 2 episode The Bad Seed, and while I think I know which character he played, his voice is pitch shifted so I can't be sure. Most of the other crew on IMDb, such as the animators, sound department, editors, and art department, are all credited as working on unknown episodes. It goes to show the lack of curated information regarding this show's production. I could definitely see this show appealing to a larger audience, so the fact that so few people are talking about it kinda baffled me. People clearly love serialization in adult animated series nowadays, based on the success of shows like BoJack Horseman, The Venture Brothers, Final Space, and many others. If any of those shows appeal to you for their serialized approach and bizarre tones, I do think you should check out The Head to watch one of the pioneering cartoons done in that format. If it wasn't for the animation, I honestly would have believed that The Head was a show made in the late 2000s due to having much deeper themes and storylines than I was expecting. I'm glad I was able to discover it, watch it, and finally pay it the attention it deserves.
Hi, this is Mike the editor. Would you like to support our channel? Please do so by watching our videos, dropping us lots of comments, good, bad, whatever you prefer. If you like this video, smash the like button with your face. If you're not subscribed already, please do so, and remember the bell icon for notifications to new videos. We also have a Patreon, which the link will be down there somewhere in the description. If you want to help us out monetarily, that'd be great. Also, the video you just watched, fair use policy, blah blah blah, something something something. We also have a Discord server, which please come and join the chat. The link will be also in the description. We already got a lot more content in the pipeline, so please stay tuned. Thank you. Bye.